There are patterns in human behavior that don't announce themselves loudly. They don't knock on your door and say, "I am the truth." Instead, they whisper through inconsistencies, through delays, through emotional presence that feels real one moment and vanishes the next. And when you are emotionally invested, you don't see the pattern, you feel it as confusion. But confusion is not love. Confusion is information. When someone operates from avoidance, they are not simply afraid of commitment in a casual sense. It is deeper than that. It is a structured emotional system designed to maintain distance while still receiving connection. And sometimes that system includes multiple emotional attachments running in parallel, not because they are incapable of connection, but because they are trying to avoid being fully held by any one connection. You will notice the first sign not in what they say, but in what they never fully clarify. Their communication stays beautifully vague. They never define you, but they also never release you. You are kept in a space that feels intentional enough to stay, but unclear enough to never settle. And that is not accident. That is emotional management. The second sign appears in cycles. They come close with intensity, then withdraw without explanation. But what you don't immediately see is that this withdrawal is not emptiness. It is redistribution. Their emotional energy doesn't disappear. It disperses. And you begin to notice that your absence does not create their pursuit. It creates their silence. The third sign is emotional unavailability, disguised as busyness. They are always occupied, always processing, always not in the right headspace. Yet somehow, there is always just enough energy for selective connection elsewhere. This is where the illusion begins to crack. Availability is not lacking. It is being allocated. The fourth sign is fragmentation in intimacy. You will feel like you are receiving only one version of them, a version that never fully arrives in depth. And that is because depth is being divided. No single connection receives the full emotional presence they are capable of offering. The fifth sign is resistance to exclusivity without emotional exit. They don't leave you, but they also don't fully choose you. This liminal state is where rotation thrives, because as long as no final decision is made, no accountability is required. But here is where wisdom must enter. Not every absence is betrayal. Not every distance is deception. But consistent emotional ambiguity always demands awareness, because your heart was never designed to live in uncertainty as a permanent home. There is a divine order to emotional connection. It grows in clarity, not confusion. It expands in truth, not contradiction. And anything that requires you to shrink your intuition in order to preserve connection is already asking too much of your spirit. You are not meant to compete with invisible attachments. You are not meant to decode silence like scripture. You are meant to be met directly, consistently, and honestly. And when you finally stop trying to interpret mixed signals as mystery and start seeing them as information, something powerful happens. You stop chasing clarity from people committed to confusion. You begin to return to yourself. And in that return, you don't lose love. You lose illusion. When someone carries an avoidant emotional pattern, their way of connecting is often built on distance that feels subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. One of the most overlooked signs is how emotional unavailability hides itself behind charm, consistency in surface-level interaction, and just enough attention to keep you emotionally engaged without ever truly letting you in. It doesn't always look like neglect. In fact, it can feel like the opposite in the beginning: attention, curiosity, even moments of warmth that seem genuine and grounding. But underneath that layer, there is a carefully maintained boundary that never fully dissolves, no matter how long the connection continues. This type of person often knows how to create emotional interest without creating emotional access. They may communicate regularly, respond in ways that feel thoughtful, or even mirror emotional language that makes you believe depth is forming. But if you pay close attention, you will notice that the depth never actually develops into something stable or expanding. It remains at a controlled level, where connection is permitted, but intimacy is limited. They can be present in conversation, but absent in emotional surrender. They can share time, but not true vulnerability. What makes this especially confusing is that avoidant individuals are not always cold or detached in an obvious way. Many of them are socially skilled, even emotionally intelligent in certain contexts. They understand how to maintain interest. They understand timing, distance, and emotional pacing. But their internal priority is not building closeness. It is maintaining autonomy while still receiving the benefits of connection. This creates a dynamic where you feel seen in moments, but not sustained in presence. You may notice that when emotional depth begins to naturally emerge, something shifts. The energy changes. The communication becomes less fluid. The openness that once felt easy starts to feel slightly restricted. They may not disappear completely, but they reduce emotional intensity. They begin to answer more mechanically, or they redirect conversations away from anything that feels too personal or too revealing. It is not always conscious manipulation. It is often an automatic defense mechanism. But the impact on the other person is still the same. You are kept close enough to stay invested, but not close enough to feel secure. This pattern can also create an illusion of potential because there are moments of warmth. Your mind begins to believe that consistency is just around the corner. You start interpreting inconsistency as timing, stress, or external pressure, rather than a structural limitation in how they relate. This is where emotional entanglement deepens. The intermittent presence becomes more powerful than consistent absence would have been. You begin to chase the version of them that shows up in rare moments, rather than accepting the pattern that defines most of the interaction. Another layer of this behavior is how avoidant individuals often avoid direct emotional labeling. They may resist defining the relationship, avoid conversations about direction, or keep things in a state that feels open but never resolved. This openness is not freedom. It is uncertainty maintained on purpose or by habit. It allows them to stay connected without responsibility, to receive emotional support without emotional obligation. And for the person on the receiving end, it creates a slow erosion of clarity, where you are emotionally invested in something that never fully takes form. Over time, this dynamic can subtly shift your internal standards. You begin to accept partial presence as connection. You begin to normalize inconsistency as personality. You start adjusting your emotional expectations downward just to maintain proximity. And without realizing it, you begin working harder for something that should have been mutual from the beginning. The most important truth hidden in this pattern is that emotional unavailability is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, structured, and even gentle in appearance. But its defining feature is that it never fully arrives. It stays just out of reach, not because you are unworthy of closeness, but because the other person's system is built to prevent full emotional merging, even when they care in their own limited way. When someone operates with an avoidant emotional structure, one of the less obvious but deeply significant behaviors is the tendency to maintain what can be described as emotional backup connections. This is not always done with dramatic intent or conscious planning in the way people imagine. It is often subtle, fragmented, and justified internally as harmless social interaction. Yet the underlying function remains consistent: to prevent any single emotional bond from becoming too consuming, too demanding, or too vulnerable. At the surface level, this can look like someone who is simply social, well-connected, or naturally expressive with multiple people. But when you observe the emotional pattern more closely, a different structure begins to appear. There is a distribution of emotional energy rather than a focused investment. Instead of deepening one connection with clarity and presence, the emotional focus is divided across multiple interactions that serve similar roles: validation, attention, comfort, distraction, and reassurance, without requiring full vulnerability in any one place. The psychological logic behind this pattern is rooted in avoidance of emotional dependency. To an avoidant mind, closeness can feel like loss of control. Emotional exclusivity can feel like pressure. So instead of allowing one connection to become central, the system unconsciously spreads emotional engagement across several outlets. This reduces perceived risk. If one connection becomes intense, another is already available to balance the emotional load. If one relationship demands depth, another provides lightness. This rotation creates a sense of control, even though it often leads to internal fragmentation. What makes this especially difficult to detect is that each individual connection may feel meaningful in isolation. When you are on the receiving end, you are not always aware of the other emotional threads running parallel. You only experience your portion of the interaction, which may include moments of genuine attention, occasional warmth, and selective vulnerability. These moments are enough to create emotional attachment, but not enough to reveal the larger pattern of divided investment. Another important layer is how avoidant individuals often manage emotional intensity through compartmentalization. Each connection is kept in its own emotional box, rarely allowed to overlap or fully reveal the existence of the others. This compartmentalization helps maintain psychological distance and prevents any single relationship from becoming all-consuming. It also reduces the emotional pressure of accountability, because no single person receives the full truth of their relational landscape. From the outside, this can appear as inconsistency or ambiguity, but internally it functions as regulation. When emotional closeness begins to rise in one connection, the avoidant system may sooner unconsciously lean into another connection that feels lighter or less demanding. This shift is not always intentional deception. It is often an automatic return to emotional equilibrium. However, the impact on those involved is still emotionally destabilizing, because intimacy is never allowed to fully stabilize or deepen. There is also a psychological reinforcement loop at play. Multiple connections provide multiple sources of validation without requiring full emotional exposure in any one direction. This creates a steady but diluted emotional supply. Instead of confronting the vulnerability of deep attachment, the individual can move between interactions that feel safe, familiar, and non-threatening. It becomes a way of staying emotionally engaged with life, while avoiding the surrender that deeper intimacy requires. For the people involved with such an individual, the experience often feels confusing, rather than clearly harmful at first. You may feel chosen in moments, but not consistently prioritized. You may notice warmth that appears genuine but lacks continuity. And because human beings naturally seek meaning in emotional highs, the intermittent attention can feel more powerful than its inconsistency would suggest. This makes it easy to misinterpret rotation as circumstance rather than structure. Over time, this dynamic can create emotional imbalance. One person may believe they are building something singular and evolving, while the other is distributing emotional presence across multiple channels. The result is not always intentional harm, but it is emotional asymmetry. One person is moving toward depth, while the other is managing distance through diversification of connection. At its core, this pattern reflects a fundamental tension between the desire for connection and the fear of being fully absorbed by it. The rotation of emotional attachments becomes a compromise, close enough to feel connected, but divided enough to avoid vulnerability. One of the most confusing dynamics in avoidant relational behavior is inconsistency in communication. At first glance, it can easily be mistaken for a busy lifestyle, competing priorities, or simple differences in texting habits. But when this inconsistency follows a pattern that repeatedly correlates with emotional closeness, a deeper structure begins to reveal itself. It is not random. It is not purely circumstantial. It is often a regulated rhythm of approach and withdrawal that protects emotional distance, while still maintaining connection. In the early stages of interaction, communication often feels surprisingly engaging. Messages may come with interest, responsiveness, and a sense of presence that makes you feel acknowledged. There is a certain ease in the exchange that creates emotional momentum. But as soon as emotional familiarity begins to grow, when conversations become more personal, more vulnerable, or more future-oriented, the rhythm shifts. Response times change. Depth decreases. The energy that once felt open begins to feel selective. This shift is where the inconsistency becomes meaningful. It is not that the person is incapable of communication. It is that communication is being unconsciously regulated based on emotional intensity. When things feel light and controlled, engagement flows. When things begin to feel emotionally demanding or intimate, engagement retracts. This creates a pattern where availability is conditional on emotional safety rather than relational growth. From the outside, this can appear as unpredictability, but from a psychological perspective, it often reflects an internal balancing act between connection and autonomy. The avoidant system wants closeness, but only up to a threshold where vulnerability is not fully activated. Once that threshold is crossed, the nervous system begins to register closeness as pressure, and withdrawal becomes a form of self-regulation. Communication slows not because interest is gone, but because emotional proximity has become uncomfortable. This is why attempts to create consistency through effort alone often fail. The inconsistency is not caused by lack of discipline or poor time management. It is driven by emotional recalibration. Even if someone consciously wants to be consistent, their unconscious response to intimacy may override that intention. As a result, communication becomes cyclical. Engagement, connection, slight emotional escalation, withdrawal, emotional reset, and re-engagement. Another layer of this pattern is selective responsiveness. You may notice that certain types of messages receive immediate attention, while others are delayed or ignored. Light, surface-level interactions often receive quicker responses, while emotionally significant messages are met with delay, deflection, or minimal engagement. This selective pattern reinforces emotional distance while preserving the appearance of involvement. It allows the person to stay connected without entering deeper emotional territory. Over time, this creates an emotional imbalance for the other person. You begin to adjust your expression, consciously or unconsciously, to match what receives response. You simplify your messages. You reduce emotional depth. You wait longer before sharing feelings. Not because your emotional experience has changed, but because the communication pattern has trained you to adapt. This is how inconsistency begins to shape behavior on both sides of the connection. There is also a powerful psychological effect created by intermittent communication. When connection is unpredictable, the moments of engagement feel more emotionally charged. A message after silence can feel disproportionately meaningful. A brief moment of attention can reset emotional uncertainty. This unpredictability strengthens attachment not through consistency, but through variability. The nervous system becomes tuned to anticipation, waiting for the next moment of reconnection. What makes this especially complex is that inconsistency does not always feel like rejection. It often feels like potential. Because there are moments of warmth, the mind holds on to the possibility that consistency is developing just beneath the surface. This creates a loop of expectation and disappointment that sustains emotional investment, even when stability is absent. In many cases, the avoidant individual is not consciously calculating this effect. Instead, they are responding to internal emotional cues, retreating when closeness feels overwhelming, returning when distance restores comfort. Communication becomes a reflection of internal regulation, rather than relational intention. The result is a pattern that feels unpredictable on the receiving end, but internally coherent to the person enacting it. At its core, this inconsistency reveals a relationship with emotional proximity that is carefully managed rather than fully surrendered to. Communication is not simply a bridge between two people. It becomes a dial that is turned up or down depending on how safe closeness feels in the moment. One of the most misunderstood patterns in avoidant relational behavior is emotional deflection, disguised as being busy, stressed, or not in the right headspace. On the surface, these explanations often sound reasonable, even responsible. Everyone experiences periods of pressure, distraction, or emotional fatigue. But in this context, what matters is not the presence of busyness itself. It is the consistency, timing, and emotional direction behind it. When busyness repeatedly appears at the exact moments where emotional depth, accountability, or relational clarity is required, it becomes less of a circumstance and more of a mechanism. Avoidant individuals often experience emotional intimacy as a form of internal pressure. When connection begins to deepen, when conversations move from casual exchange into emotional honesty, future orientation, or relational definition, something inside them begins to tighten. Not necessarily because they do not care, but because closeness activates a vulnerability response that feels overwhelming or destabilizing. Instead of confronting that discomfort directly, the system finds relief through disengagement, and one of the most socially acceptable forms of disengagement is the narrative of being busy. This is where emotional deflection becomes powerful. It does not reject you outright. It does not create an obvious rupture. Instead, it gently shifts the focus away from the emotional moment. A vulnerable conversation is paused because work is crazy right now. A question about direction is delayed because I've just been overwhelmed lately. A need for clarity is softened with, I need time to think. On the surface, these responses preserve politeness and connection, but underneath they serve a different function. They prevent emotional exposure. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize is that avoidant deflection often contains partial truth. The person may indeed be busy, may indeed be stressed, may indeed be dealing with internal or external pressure, but the key distinction lies in pattern. Healthy busyness does not consistently interrupt emotional progression. It does not repeatedly appear at every threshold of intimacy. It does not selectively silence emotional accountability while leaving lighter forms of communication intact. Over time, a pattern emerges where emotional presence is always just slightly out of reach. Light conversations remain possible. Casual check-ins are still present. Even moments of humor or affection may continue. But when the emotional tone deepens, something shifts. The timing changes. The energy retracts. The conversation gets postponed rather than engaged. This creates a relational structure where emotional depth is perpetually deferred, never fully refused, but never fully met either. Another subtle layer of this behavior is how deflection preserves self-image. Many avoidant individuals do not see themselves as unavailable or emotionally distant. In fact, they may genuinely believe they are doing their best within their capacity. By attributing withdrawal to external circumstances, time, work, stress, they maintain a self-concept of being responsible and well-intentioned, rather than avoidant or emotionally resistant. This allows them to avoid the discomfort of self-confrontation. However, the impact on the other person is still significant. Emotional deflection creates a loop of waiting without resolution. You begin to associate clarity with later. Emotional conversations become something that always requires better timing, better energy, better conditions. But those conditions rarely arrive in a sustained way. As a result, emotional needs are not rejected outright, they are postponed indefinitely. This indefinite postponement can subtly shift your internal emotional rhythm. You may start suppressing your needs to avoid being too much during their busy periods. You may begin timing your emotional expression around their availability rather than your own emotional reality. Without realizing it, you start adapting your emotional truth to fit their fluctuating capacity, rather than expecting mutual presence in moments that matter. Deflection also creates a psychological imbalance in responsibility. The avoidant person becomes the one who sets the conditions for emotional engagement. If they are available, connection proceeds. If they are overwhelmed, connection pauses. This places the emotional structure of the relationship in their hands, while the other person remains in a responsive position, adjusting and waiting. Over time, this can create a quiet erosion of relational equality. There is also an important emotional contradiction embedded in this pattern. The same individual who avoids emotional depth due to feeling overwhelmed is often still capable of maintaining multiple lighter interactions simultaneously. This is because emotional intensity, not connection itself, is what triggers withdrawal. So energy is not absent, it is selectively allocated. This reinforces the illusion that the issue is external pressure, when in reality, it is often internal regulation of intimacy. What makes emotional deflection so compelling is that it rarely feels like rejection in the given moment. It feels like delay, like timing, like something that will eventually resolve itself once circumstances improve. But without awareness, delay becomes structure. And what was meant to be temporary becomes the default way emotional needs are handled, always. Acknowledged, rarely met. One of the most revealing dynamics in avoidant relational behavior is the resistance to exclusivity while still refusing emotional exit. On the surface, this can appear confusing, even contradictory. If someone is not fully choosing a relationship, why not simply leave? And if they are still present, why does the connection never fully stabilize into clarity? The answer lies in a very specific emotional equilibrium. Staying close enough to receive connection, but not so committed that emotional responsibility becomes unavoidable. This state is not simply indecision. It is a regulated form of relational positioning, where ambiguity becomes a protective space. Exclusivity represents emotional focus, accountability, and depth. It requires choosing one connection as primary, which naturally increases vulnerability, expectation, and emotional exposure. For an avoidant system, that level of definition can feel like confinement, not because the connection itself is unwanted, but because the emotional weight of being fully known, fully relied upon, and fully present can feel overwhelming. At the same time, emotional exit, fully leaving the connection, creates another form of discomfort. It introduces separation, loss, and the absence of validation. So instead of moving fully into closeness or fully into distance, the individual unconsciously occupies a middle space. This in-between state allows them to remain emotionally engaged without fully committing to the structure that deeper intimacy requires. From the outside, this often looks like mixed signals. There may be affection without clarity, attention without definition, presence without direction. You may feel emotionally acknowledged but never fully chosen. Conversations about exclusivity may be avoided, delayed, or reframed in ways that soften their urgency. Phrases like, "let's not rush things," or "I don't like labels," or "I just want to go with the flow," can become common. While these statements are not inherently unhealthy, in this context they often serve to preserve emotional flexibility rather than build relational structure. This flexibility is important to understand. It is not simply about avoiding commitment, it is about maintaining access. As long as exclusivity is not established, the individual retains the freedom to regulate emotional distance at will. They can engage deeply when it feels comfortable and withdraw when it feels overwhelming, without violating any clear relational agreement. This creates a system where connection exists, but accountability remains diffuse. One of the most impactful effects of this pattern is how it shapes emotional interpretation on the receiving end. Because there is no clear rejection, the mind continues to search for signs of progress. Because there is no clear commitment, the mind continues to seek validation through moments of closeness. This creates a persistent internal tension between hope and uncertainty. You are emotionally invested in something that feels alive, but never fully defined. Over time, this ambiguity can subtly shift your internal standards. You may begin to normalize partial presence as a form of connection. You may start interpreting avoidance of definition as a phase rather than a pattern. You may even begin to believe that if you just remain patient enough, understanding enough, or emotionally steady enough, clarity will eventually emerge. This creates a dynamic where your emotional energy is invested into stabilizing something that is structurally designed to remain fluid. There is also an important psychological benefit for the avoidant individual in maintaining this state. It allows them to receive emotional support, companionship, and validation without entering the full emotional responsibility that exclusivity demands. They can experience closeness without obligation, intimacy without structure, and connection without accountability. This can feel emotionally safe in the short term, but it often prevents the development of deeper relational security over time. The resistance to exclusivity is also closely tied to identity preservation. Commitment can feel like loss of autonomy, as if choosing one connection means restricting other possibilities or limiting emotional freedom. Even if those other possibilities are not actively pursued, their perceived presence creates a sense of openness that helps regulate internal anxiety. Exclusivity, by contrast, narrows emotional options and increases perceived dependence on a single bond, which can feel destabilizing for someone with avoidant tendencies. Yet, despite this resistance, complete emotional exit is also avoided. This is because disengagement fully removes the emotional supply the connection provides. So instead of choosing between presence or absence, the system chooses partial presence, enough connection to feel engaged, enough distance to feel safe. This balance can persist for long periods, especially when the other person continues to invest emotionally without requiring clarity. What makes this pattern particularly complex is that it often looks like almost relationship energy. It has the emotional texture of closeness without the structural definition of commitment. And because humans naturally seek completion, the mind keeps trying to resolve it into something stable. But without conscious awareness, this unresolved state can become a prolonged emotional holding pattern, where one person is waiting for definition and the other is maintaining flexibility. One of the deepest illusions within avoidant relational dynamics is the way mixed signals are, mistaken for emotional mystery, depth, or hidden complexity, when in reality they often reflect emotional compartmentalization and inconsistent internal regulation. What feels like confusion on the receiving end is frequently not confusion at all on the inside of the avoidance system. Instead, it is a structured way of separating emotional states so that no single connection holds the full weight of vulnerability, responsibility, or emotional exposure. At the beginning, mixed signals can feel almost intoxicating. There are moments of closeness that seem genuine, even meaningful, followed by sudden distance that creates emotional absence. This alternating rhythm produces a powerful psychological effect. The mind naturally tries to resolve inconsistency into meaning. It assumes there must be a deeper reason, a hidden layer, or an emotional truth that has not yet been revealed. In this search for coherence, ambiguity begins to feel like depth. But ambiguity is not depth. It is lack of integration. In avoidant behavior, emotional compartmentalization allows different emotional states to exist separately without being fully integrated into a single relational narrative. One version of the person may be affectionate, attentive, and emotionally available in one moment or with one person, while another version is distant, detached, or unavailable in another context. These states do not necessarily contradict each other internally, because they are not being processed as one unified emotional identity in relation to one consistent bond. Instead, they are separated into contexts, moments, or connections that never fully overlap. This separation creates the appearance of inconsistency, but internally it functions as regulation. When emotional intensity increases in one interaction, the system may reduce exposure by shifting attention elsewhere or by emotionally down-regulating presence. When distance becomes too great, reconnection occurs to restore emotional equilibrium. This cycle is not always conscious strategy. Often, it is an automatic response to managing internal discomfort around closeness. From the outside, however, this creates a destabilizing experience. You are not given a consistent emotional baseline. Instead, you receive fragments of connection that feel meaningful in isolation but do not form a stable whole. One day may feel emotionally significant while the next feels distant or unclear. Because there is no clear continuity, the mind begins to fill the gaps with interpretation. You start analyzing tone, timing, patterns, and subtle shifts in behavior, attempting to decode what is actually happening. This is where mixed signals begin to gain psychological power. The brain is wired to seek patterns and resolution, especially in emotionally charged situations. When clarity is absent, but emotional engagement is present, the mind becomes highly active in constructing meaning. This is why intermittent emotional reinforcement can feel more compelling than consistent. Neutrality. The unpredictability keeps attention locked in, because each moment of connection feels like it might be the one that finally resolves uncertainty. However, the core issue is that the signals are not actually designed to communicate a stable, emotional intention. They are expressions of fluctuating internal states, rather than a unified relational direction. This means that trying to interpret them as a coherent message often leads to misalignment. You may interpret warmth as progress, distance as setback, and inconsistency as something that needs to be solved. But in reality, the pattern itself may be the stable condition, not a temporary disruption. Over time, this dynamic can subtly reshape emotional perception. You may become more sensitive to small changes in tone or availability. You may begin to overanalyze minimal shifts as significant indicators of emotional change. This heightened awareness can create emotional exhaustion because your attention is constantly engaged in interpreting rather than simply experiencing. The relationship becomes less about connection and more about decoding. Another important aspect of this pattern is how it can create an illusion of exclusivity without structure. Because there are meaningful moments of connection, it can feel as though something real is developing beneath the surface. Yet without consistent integration, those moments remain isolated events rather than building blocks of a stable bond. The emotional narrative becomes episodic rather than continuous. What is often missed in this process is that clarity is not something hidden within the mixed signals waiting to be discovered. Clarity exists in the pattern itself. The inconsistency, the fragmentation, and the shifting availability are not obstacles to understanding the connection. They are the expression of how the connection is being maintained. When this is recognized, the focus shifts from decoding meaning to observing structure. In that recognition, mixed signals lose their authority as something mysterious and become something more understandable, a reflection of divided emotional engagement rather than unified relational intention. Thank you for your time and attention throughout this journey. Every insight shared here was meant to bring clarity where confusion once lived and awareness where emotional uncertainty may have taken root. Sometimes understanding these patterns is not about judging others, but about seeing clearly enough to return to your own center with honesty and strength. If anything here helped you reflect, release, or realign with your emotional truth, then it has already served its purpose. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and let the rest dissolve without weight. Wishing you clarity in your thoughts, peace in your heart, and depth in every connection you choose moving forward. Goodbye for now.